Welcome back to our course on disaster management. I am Dr. Nagalapuram Muni Pradeep, Assistant Professor, Department of Civil Engineering, SR University. So we are in Unit 1, you know already, Introduction to Disaster Management. And today we begin Lecture 3. So today our topic is, for this session is impacts of disasters, which covering the social, economic as well as environmental aspects. And one more thing is there, that is health aspects, which is interrelated to social impacts. Okay, so in our previous two lectures we build the foundation, we build the foundational vocabulary of disaster management. So today we take the next logical step. So till now we know what disasters are. So now we are going to understand what disasters will do and what is a real world impact when a disaster strikes. Right? So, and when disaster will strike, how does it affect? It will affect the society and the economy and as well as natural environment. And why does understanding of these impacts matter for the work we do as an engineers and disaster managers? So these are the questions we'll answer today. So by the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain what is social, economic and environmental consequences of disasters with in-depth knowledge, and we connect them to real-world examples from India and around the world. So with this introduction, we'll directly open the next slide. Okay, so before I'll explaining the today's lecture, I'll quickly recap of previous lecture who missed that part A, lecture 2 part A and part B. So this is quickly recap of previous lecture. Right. So in lecture 2 we covered 7 major areas. I'll quickly review them briefly. The first one is concept of disaster. So you know what is the concept of disaster? The most important idea in that is disaster is not a simply a powerful natural event. A disaster occurs when hazardous event affects a vulnerable community and causes serious disruption and damage. So the second concept what we discussed in the lecture 2, that is concept of hazard and its comparison with the disaster. So you know that hazard is a dangerous phenomenon, so with the potential to cause any kind of harm. So a disaster occurs when that hazards actually affects the people, property, infrastructure or the environment. So for example, the same earthquake may remain only a hazard in an uninhabited desert, because there the livelihood was no one is lived in that uninhabited desert. So the hazard is still considered as hazard only, it never converted as disaster. But same thing happened, it became disaster when it is concentrated on densely populated city. And the third one is classification of hazards. So we classified hazards in 7 ways. The first one is natural and man-made disasters. Second one, direct and indirect hazards. Third one, short-term and long-term hazards. And we also discussed 5 broader categories, that is sudden onset hazards, slow onset hazards, so technological hazard, war-related hazard, and epidemic hazards. So if you want in-depth knowledge about these classifications, you can simply please go through the lecture 2, both part A and part B. The fourth concept what we discussed in the last lecture, that is vulnerability and its comparison with hazard and disaster. Right? So here we discussed about 9 major types of vulnerability, that is economic, social, ecological, organizational, educational, attitudinal, political, cultural, and finally physical vulnerability. So this one also we discussed in detail in the lecture 2. And the fifth point what we discussed, that is concept and components of a disaster risk. So here we discussed about one formula, that is disaster risk equal to hazard probability into the vulnerability. This means the disaster risk will increases when either hazard intensity or vulnerability increases. If any one will increase also, the disaster risk will be increased. And the sixth point what we discussed, that is risk perception and risk identification. So we learned that risk perception depends mainly on four factors. That is exposure to the disaster. Second one is familiarity. Third one is dread, and fourth one is preventability. So these 4 points also we discussed in the lecture 2. And the seventh one we discussed about the capacity building. So here capacity refers to the strengths, resources, institutions and skills available within a community to resist or to respond and to recover from the disasters. So this community capacity building is exactly opposite to the disaster. This is a positive outcome. So this capacity building through training, through awareness, and by developing the infrastructure, by providing the institutional support and the proper participation from the community is one of the most important aspects of disaster risk reduction. So still, if anyone have any questions from the previous lecture, you may comment below on that video. So or you can contact me through the mail. So with this brief note, I'll start today's lecture. Right? I'll give you 30 seconds. You please go through the slide so that I'll explain in detail. Okay? Because many students gave, I got the feedback that, sir, you are not providing time to go through the PDF slide. So from now onwards, every slide I'll give you 30 seconds. You please go through the PPT slide. Then I'll start explaining. Right? Okay. So now I'll start the next slide, that is impacts of disaster. So let me start the session by setting the below context. When a disaster strikes, most people immediately think of the visible destruction, right? So visible destruction means it may be either collapsed buildings and all the roads were flooded and forests were burned, and yes, these all are comes under visible destruction. This that immediate physical destruction is real and it is terrible to the people. So, but the impacts of disasters go far deeper and far wider than what is visible in first 24 hours. Obviously, people are mainly concentrated about first 24 hours because that is visible and it is very terrible also. But the thing is, after 24 hours, the impacts are even very deeper and very wide. Okay, so the first point on this slide tells us disasters disrupt normal life and it will damage the infrastructure and it will pose very serious threats to human safety as well as the development, right? So this disruption is not temporary for most communities. See, many people are below poverty line. These disruptions are permanent things. They are not temporary for many communities in our society. For vulnerable populations, a single major disaster can reverse decades of development process, right? One simple disaster, it can reverse decades of our development progress. So I'll give you one context. So you think about a family that has spent nearly 20 years building, right? So with their 20 years of earnings, they build a home, they save money, and they're educating their children, right? So a flood or an earthquake can destroy all of that in a matter of minute. Yes or no? So within a matter of minute, they lost everything. So the physical home can perhaps be rebuilt in a few years. Within next 5 to 6 years or within 10 years, they may rebuild their house. But the lost savings, the interrupted education of their kids, and the trauma, the debts, these all are lingered to the next generation. Right? Right? So now coming to the second point on the slide, which is very crucial, the impacts of disasters which go beyond immediate destruction. They affect the economy, they affect the environment, they affect the public health as well as social stability. So this is why disaster management is a multidisciplinary field. It is not just about search and rescue, it is not about the public health, economies, right? So it is not only about the search and rescue, it is about the how we are considering the public health, economies, the ecology, psychology, psychology of the people who are undergoing the trauma, and the law as well as governance all at once, which includes the disaster management. Right? Right. For example, when a cyclone strikes a coastal district, right? If you take the Vishakhapatnam, that is coastal district. When a cyclone strikes a coastal district, the immediate impact is destruction of buildings and infrastructure. But within a days, you can see the secondary impacts. What is that? The main thing was very few people were considering this. That is, the secondary impacts are there is a spreading of waterborne diseases, the outbreaking of waterborne diseases, and disruption of food supply chains, and many people they lost their jobs. See, job losses as a fisherman because they cannot go to the sea, their children missing the schools as their school is converted into relief camps, right? And farmers they're losing their standing crops. All of these are disaster impacts, even though they are not caused directly by the cyclone. See here, cyclone effect within one day we are talking about only destruction of buildings, but these all are secondary effects which are directly associated with the cyclone winds, right? Now coming to the third point, the third point raises an important observation. See, if you consider any community, some community people they recover very quickly, and other community people they may suffer very long-term consequences that hinder their growth as well as their well-being. So why do some communities recover very fast? Just think, why do some communities they recover very fast? Because they have greater capacity, they have more financial resources, they have very stronger institutions, they have better built infrastructure, and finally, and the most important, they have very great social cohesion. But in the contrast, on the other hand, communities with low capacity, particularly poor people, marginalized people, as well as geographically isolated communities, they may take decades to fully recover. In some cases, they never fully recover also to their lifetime. So this is injustice at the heart of disasters. They hit the most vulnerable, the hardest, and they deepen existing inequality. A rich household in a flood zone can move to a safer area, but a poor household they cannot move. A well-insured businessman can rebuild after a fire. An uninsured small shop they cannot insure what they lost. So understanding this inequality is very essential for designing very fair and effective disaster management policies, right? So this is the main duty of that disaster management. Whoever the engineer, whoever the civil engineer, we are planning this all disaster management activities. So he has to consider this point, right? So this slide may looking only 3 points, but we have it represents very in-depth explanation of the importance of the effects of disasters. Coming to the next slide. So, as we discussed in the previous slide, so I already explained the different four impacts. So here I will explain in detail. Right? So take 30 seconds to go through the slide. Sorry. Right. So this slide actually the present slide gives us the organizing framework for today's exact lecture. So the disasters can directly and indirectly impact four major categories of aspects. The first one, social, economical impacts, environmental impacts, as well as fourth one and final one, health impacts. So the figure on this slide visually represents these four impacts are interconnected areas of disaster impact, right? So it is very important to understand that these four categories are not independent. See, many people thought the impacts means social impacts are separate, economical impacts are separate, environmental impacts are separate, as well as health impacts are separate. See, in my first lecture also, I explained individually only, but in this lecture, I'll explain how they influence and how they amplify each other. the each impact, how they influence the other impact, and how they amplify each other. So I'll give you one context. For example, there is an environmental destruction after a flood leads to contamination of water resource. So which is considered as health impact, right? So environmental destruction after a flood. After a flood, here the main point was after the flood, whatever the environmental destruction, it leads to contamination of water sources, which is comes under health impact, right? That health impact then prevents workers from returning to their jobs, which is directly related to economical impact. And the economic hardships forces all these families to send children to their work instead of the school, which is social impact. You can see here one disaster cascading through all four dimensions simultaneously. So I'll give you one more example. So with this you can understand even very clearly. Suppose you consider very severe cyclone striking a coastal village at midnight. Same. Here also we will consider Visakhapatnam, coastal city. One village near coastal city of Visakhapatnam. So that village severely hit by a cyclone at midnight, right? So the first point, the first one, the cyclone first destroys all the houses, and it destroys the road network, all the electrical lines, the crops and fishing boats. So this is a direct physical and environmental impact. See here, it is direct physical as well as environmental impact, because drinking water pipelines are severely damaged, and all the flood water mixed with the sewage water, and you cannot drink that water. So when this water mixed with the sewage water, the people began suffering from diarrhea, dengue and lot of skin infections. And now suddenly hospitals becomes overcrowded, medicines became scarce, and the children and elderly people suffer the most, because these two have very less immunity power. So this becomes a major health impact. The first one is environmental impact, and it is directly associated with cascading with health impact. So now, at the same time, the fishermen lose their boats, obviously, and the farmers lose their crops, and as well as small shop owners, they lose their businesses, and then daily wage workers, suddenly they have no income. The families who are already financially very weak, they fall into more debts within these days. This becomes an economic impact. So now we discussed environmental, health as well as economic, and what is the final one? Now the social impact began to appear. Within next few days there is no consideration of social impacts, but now the social impacts began to appear to everyone. What in the basis of, in what form? All the children, they stop going to school because schools are converted into relief camps, and some children are very forced into labor to support their families. They lost everything, right? And many young girls are pushed into early marriages because their parents cannot afford food and education to their, especially the girls, right? And the severe stress, trauma, domestic violence and migration which increases within the community. See here one cyclone, but the damage spreads like falling dominoes, from environment destruction to health crisis, from health crisis to economical collapse, and from economical collapse to very deep social suffering. So that is why disasters are never only physical events. They become human tragedies affecting every dimension of life simultaneously. This interconnectedness is why disaster response must be comprehensive. I'm repeating, whatever this interconnectedness is why disaster response must be very comprehensive. A government that focuses only on rebuilding physical infrastructure after a disaster without addressing health, livelihood, education as well as environmental restoration will find that its communities remain trapped in a cycle of vulnerability. So in today's lecture, we will go through each of these four categories very in detail. First, we will begin with the social, and then we move to economic, and then we'll move to environmental, and health impacts are went throughout the social section as they are closely connected. See, if you go through the any authors from the foreign, so they interconnected both social as well as health in the same category. Okay, right? Now we'll start the next. We'll move to the social impacts. Please go through the slide. Please go through the slide for 30 seconds. Right. So let us now enter the first major category, that is the social impacts of disasters. See, the opening statement of this slide is very, very important. Disasters not only affect physical infrastructure but also affects people's social lives. So as an engineer, as a disaster management engineer or a civil engineer, as an engineer, we are trying to look at the physical items only, that is physical outcomes, that is the broken bridge or the collapsed buildings, and the road may be flooded. So as an engineer we always look into these physical aspects, but disasters shatter something that is very hard to rebuild than concrete. If you talk in civil engineering point of view, disaster shatters something that is harder to rebuild than concrete, because all our broken bridges, collapsed buildings, flooded roads, everything we can rebuild with the concrete, but that broken hearts we cannot rebuild with the concrete. That is the social fabric of a community. So now many people have doubt, so what do we mean by social fabric? We mean the social fabric means the relationships, the institutions, and the shared norms that hold a community together. I'm repeating, the social fabric means the relationships, whatever the institutions, and the shared norms that hold all the community together. So a community is not just a collection of the buildings, it is a network of families, the schools, the hospitals, the places of worship, the local markets, and the community organizations. So when a disaster strikes, it does not just destroying the buildings, it tears apart all these networks. So that will be the tragic part of disasters. So now coming to the second point on this slide, which tells us that social impacts include the displacement, the mental trauma, and breakdown of communal systems, right? The displacement, mental trauma, and breakdown of communal systems. So think about what displacement means in practice. So what is the displacement? You just think about for 10 seconds. What is the displacement? Because in physics displacement means another meaning, if you go to the civil engineering subjects displacement means another feeling, so another meaning. So in disaster management, what is the meaning of displacement? So when a family is forced to flee their home and move to the relief camp, they left everything and they move to the relief camp because they have to, the ultimate point is first they have to survive that day. So they lose not just their house, they lose their neighborhood, they lose their support system, their children's schools, their access to healthcare, and their livelihood. All of these at once. So this comes under displacement, right? So now the third point emphasizes something we have discussed before. The population most vulnerable to disasters face the worst consequences. The poor, the women, the children, the elderly people, and the people with disabilities and marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by disasters. Right? I'm repeating, the most vulnerable population to disasters to face the worst consequences are the poor, the women, the kids, the elder people, people with disabilities, and marginalized communities. So this is not an accidental. It is a result of decades of structural inequality that leaves some people less able to protect themselves and recover from the shocks. In following slides, we'll study 5 specific social impacts in detail, that is loss of lives and displacement, health and psychological effects, disruption of education, the vulnerability, and social inequality. So let us go through each one. Please go through the image also and the points also for 30 seconds. Okay. So the first and most direct social impact of any disaster is the loss of human life and the displacement of people from their homes. So now already we discussed what is the displacement. So let us examine each point on this slide very carefully. So the first point, the significant number of deaths and injuries. So every major disaster results in fatalities, right? The scale varies enormously from a few dozen in a well-prepared community to hundreds of thousands in an unprepared community. So, according to the United Nations, so between 2000 to 2019, approximately 1.23 million people, 1.23 million people died globally due to disasters. What is the meaning of 1 million? 1 million means 10 lakhs. 1.23 million means nearly 12.3 lakhs people died globally only due to disasters. That is an average of over 60,000 deaths per year. So 60,000 deaths per year, they died because of disasters. In India alone, the National Disaster Management Authority estimates that disasters cause thousands of deaths every year with major events like, for suppose if we consider 2001 Bush earthquake, they're claiming nearly 20,000 lives in a single event, right? So there is a significant number of deaths and injuries. So government or all people are only talking about the deaths, but no one is talking about the injuries. So beyond the deaths, there are many more injuries: fractures, burn, amputations, and internal injuries. So amputation means many people they lost their leg, arms, or any body organs that comes under amputations. So many injured survivors face long-term disability that permanently changes their ability to earn a livelihood and participate in family and community life. Right? So the second point is forced migration. When homes are destroyed or rendered uninhabitable, people are forced to migrate either temporarily to relief camps or some people they permanently shifted to other places. This forced migration is called displacement. Is one of the most traumatic experiences a family can undergo because displacement strips people of everything familiar: their home, their neighborhood, their social network, and their sense of identity and their belongings. They lost everything. So this is the most tragic thing anything happened to people. So India has one of the highest rates of disaster induced displacement in the world. So, according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, millions of Indians are displaced every year due to only floods, particularly in states like Assam, Bihar, West Bengal, and Odisha. Only due to the floods, many people they displaced. And the next one, third point, the families are separated and children often orphaned or lost. In the case of a sudden disaster, for suppose a tsunami or an earthquake or a flash flood, families are often separated. The parents lose their children. The best example was if you watch, so if in movie point of view, if you watch the Chhatrapati movie, so the like the hero, whoever Prabhas and and his mother both are separated. So children lose their parents. Elderly members are left behind during rest evacuations because they are unable to cope up with that evacuation process. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami created thousands of orphaned children across Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Andaman Islands. So many of these children faced additional risks of trafficking and exploitation in the aftermath. See how tragic incidents these are. That kids are going through human trafficking. So on the next one, community networks disrupted either destroyed. So communities are built on the networks of neighborhoods who help each other, the local leaders who organize welfare activities, the temples and the churches are mosques that serve as a community centers and market that provide livelihoods. So when a disaster destroys a neighborhood, it does not just destroy the buildings, it scatters the people who made those buildings a community. So rebuilding the physical structure is relatively straightforward, and the rebuilding the human network takes far longer. Sometimes it is impossible. Next one, the final point in this slide, the overcrowding in temporary shelters or relief camps. So we have very last class we discussed nearly 880 relief centers in the Orissa, and that to be record. What about in other states? So when a large number of displaced people are concentrated in temporary relief camps, overcrowding becomes a very serious issue. So the relief camps often lack adequate sanitation. They have adequate clean drinking water, proper food supply is not there, and mainly the privacy, especially for women. So overcrowded conditions rapidly led to the spread of infectious diseases, especially for kids and elder people. The post-disaster cholera outbreaks, for example, are almost always linked to overcrowded camps with poor sanitation. The 2010 Haiti earthquake killed over nearly 160,000 people directly, but the subsequent cholera epidemic, which spread through displaced person camps, killed an additional 10,000 people over the following years. So the people are mainly talking about the people or government or anyone. They're mainly talking about the 160,000 people who have died in the 2010 Haiti earthquake. What about the next 10,000 people, right? So with this, so I almost crossed full session. So I thought of making part B for this session also, because full length sessions, 30 to 35 minute sessions are, I thought, very effective to students to concentrate on for one topic, right? So you can easily follow what we discussed for 30 minutes, right? So next, environmental, the continuation of social, environmental, health, as well as economical. I'll start in part B, lecture 3, part B. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you for following me, right? Thank you.